All right, good morning, good morning. Let's try this again. Good morning. There we go, there we go. Well, welcome. My name is Esmanario Bassi. I have the pleasure of serving as the Vice President for Research and Innovation here at Wayne State University. Really excited to have everyone here today, particularly in this building where this is our Industry Innovation Center, a place where we do a lot of interesting collaborations with our corporate partners, whether it's in mobility, whether it's in clean energy, spaces in health innovation. When you look across the street, you have Tech Town, and then our Integrated iBio Center. Essentially, this is our innovation space for Wayne State, and we're really excited about having this conversation today, particularly as it relates to some of the collaborative work, because that's something we put a lot of energy into. And so if you're interested in collaborating with Wayne, go to our website, open.wayne.edu, or email us at open@wayne.edu. Really happy to start new partnerships if there's any interest. I also want to sort of take a little bit of time to sort of promote, some of the things we're proud of, especially as we're going to talk about cross-border collaborations, and particularly with the University of Windsor. Wayne State has worked collaboratively with the University of Windsor to put up a UN center that focuses on some really good things that we're proud of, particularly in the area of food waste, clean water, and thinking of ways in which we can do better in partnership. And so today I'm really excited to hear the discussion, knowing how important our partnerships is with Canada, and looking forward to seeing how we can help move the needle forward as well. So thank you and welcome to Wayne State.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our forum. I think it's going to be an enlightening morning. Let's get started with our panelists. From the Greater Detroit Chamber of Commerce, please welcome Sandy Baruah. I'm glad I'm not the only one that missed my quick. Sandy, of course, has worked in several administrations and joins us as he prepares for the big powwow up at Mackinac that I hope you all will be attending. You don't mind if I make that pitch?
No. In fact, please do. The $20 I promised you is on its way.
There we go. This is Venmo. Also, let's welcome in the still newly minted senator from the great state of Michigan, Elissa Slotkin. As you know, Senator Slotkin brings a broad range of interests, most notably in national security, which is one of the primary interests for the tariffs that we are now enduring. So we can talk about that within the context of making America strong. She has also supported policies that have made our supply chain more resilient, and is a big believer in a strong U.S.-Canada relationship as it relates to national and economic security. And finally, our special guest, I'd say from across the river, but he lives in Detroit. Please welcome Colin Bird, the Consul General of Canada in Detroit. An enthusiastic representative of both our trade and economic interests here in the state of Michigan, who also worked on, as we all know, the key agreement, the reboot of NAFTA, the USMCA. So good morning to all three of you.
Good morning.
Let's get started. I think, one of the things that I think is fascinating is you all three have such diverse constituencies. Senator, labor, business, mom and pop. You hear from everybody.
Yep.
Colin, you certainly hear from an international spectrum of interests. Sandy, from the business community, it's big, it's small, and everything in between. I don't think there are a few things that crystallize this interconnectivity between Canada and Michigan, as well as what you're hearing and whom you're hearing it from. Sandy, let me start with you.
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here, and it's such an honor to be with Colin and the senator. I've said this before, but I've never said it to you. Hit it out of the park on the response to the State of the Union address. That's a thankless job, but the senator did a fantastic job with that. So even though the three of us represent different constituencies, as Guy said it, I think you're going to be hearing some really common themes amongst the three of us. First of all, from the business community, what we're hearing is the initial excitement about the new administration was genuine. Even those business leaders who didn't necessarily vote for President Trump were frankly excited, or at least looking forward to a less regulatory intensive environment. They were looking for that kind of guarantee, or more of a guarantee, that the 2017 tax cuts would continue. So there was some real excitement there. Now, what we're hearing is it's beginning to look a lot like COVID, in the sense that business leaders are really struggling with a level of uncertainty that they were not expecting, not planning for. And as we all know, businesses, and frankly any leader, you need the ability to forecast. You need to be able to look ahead and kind of know what the landscape is going to be. And we're seeing forecasts both from companies, the OECD, even companies that you wouldn't think would be directly impacted by tariffs, like say Delta Airlines has gone from a 9% growth outlook for this year to 3% based on the uncertainty. So uncertainty is now the big bugaboo in the business community.
Senator?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thanks for being here. I mean, I think, what we're seeing is from kind of all sides, the national security community, which of course I'm very close to, there's plenty of people, I think, who are interested in the tool of a tariff on a place like China, even though I know that's still controversial in Michigan, where we're so interconnected. There's, I think, more of an understanding of the national security implications of an intertwined trade relationship with China. I think where it changes drastically is with Canada, right? Canada and Mexico, because of our agreements, but the national security community having to look at a document that declares Canada a national security threat is pretty tough for those of us who grew up as a CIA officer. Literally, we share everything with our English-speaking cousins, and I'm talking about some of the most sensitive information we have out there. So I think from a national security perspective, it's bracing. But then, as a brand new senator, 2 months in, I can't tell you the number of folks from Michigan, whether it's our companies, both small and large, I mean, certainly, but also our farmers. I'm on the agriculture committee, and Canada is our biggest market for our farmers here in Michigan. We have processing facilities set up just to handle Canadian agriculture products. So our farmers, who are, they're no bleeding heart liberals.
No,
right?
but they've seen this movie before. With the Chinese tariffs, and they lost their soybean markets permanently.
So I think, and the farmers are very concerned. The last time we went through this, they lost market share permanently to places like Brazil and Argentina for our soybeans. But then quietly, the Trump administration subsidized those farmers. And farmers do not like having to take handouts, right? That's not how they're brought up to be trained. So I think there's a lot of concern, well, what if we put these tariffs on and now we're in this cycle of losing market share and maybe being paid off, maybe not. So I think that there's just a lot of angst in the system. And as Sandy said, predictability is what everyone's asking for. No matter if you're in the national security world, in the agriculture world, in the manufacturing world, just give us a set of left and right limits that we can follow, and we'll do it, and we can succeed, and they feel tense. I like the analogy of this feels like the uncertainty of COVID, because there's just angst in the system.
So news of the day, the market is set to open in a few minutes. It looks again like the futures are signaling for about a 120-point decline on the Dow. The retail sales numbers just came out at 8:30. They were at 0.2% above what they were in January. The economists polled by the Journal were expecting 0.6. So it was 1/3 of what the expected increase was. There's a lot of orange flashing lights out there about whether or not this soft landing is going to be as soft as we had all hoped. I preface that because as I was putting on the tie for the first time in 2025, CNBC was on in my office. Kevin Hassett, the leading economist for the Trump administration, was on explaining this tariff. And they put up a bar graph of all the monetary tariffs of all of our leading trading partners. And Canada's was the smallest of the 15 or so that were on the full screen graphic. That's one of those data points that seems to be getting lost in the conversation and the narrative and the rhetoric coming from the White House. Colin, please speak to that, and also what you're hearing from your side.
Absolutely. So you're right, it's 99% tariff-free in terms of Canada-US trade, and it's free and fair trade, and we're partners. So first, thank you to Wayne State for hosting us in this great facility. Thank you, Guy. Sorry, I'm Canadian, so we say
That was
Guy.
amazing. I'm calling you Guy
You're not the
forever now.
first.
He's been called worse.
Right.
Yeah.
And Senator Slotkin, I think the work you're doing to stand up for Michigan in Washington right now, from our perspective in Canada, is standing up for Canada as well, so thank you for that. And I just want to say to Sandy, the work that you and the Detroit Regional Chamber have been doing to build an innovation economy that's world-class here in Michigan is hugely important to both of us. And you and I have talked a lot about how that innovation corridor does not stop at the border, right? It hops the river into Windsor. It goes through Canada's Quantum Valley in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. You have, within just a few hours' drive of Detroit, the leading commercial hub in Toronto, of the 9th largest economy in the world, with huge innovation going on that's so directly integrated with what you've got here. And it's just, I think people don't realize the size of this, when you've got 7,000 trucks every day crossing at Detroit, Windsor, just how important that is, that we have an integrated economic space that we have created over 100 years. But really in the last 50 years, that has accelerated so that you talk about cars before being finally assembled on either side of that border, cross it 6 or 7 times. That's a lot of incidents of tariff hit that really would cripple the auto sector here in the Great Lakes region. And we make things together in a way that is a profound statement to the world. And that's really where I worry about the moment that we're in. Because we are big fans of the American project. And by American project, I'm not talking about an annexation plan. I'm talking about the system of alliances, the breaking down of trade barriers for our mutual prosperity, a system of rule of law and multilateral institutions in the world. And this region is disproportionately impacted, bar any other region in the United States, if that system starts to crumble. So we have a job to defend it.
Every economist we've had on has says that no state is more vulnerable.
Yeah.
No city is more vulnerable, with the possible exception of Laredo, Texas, to the kind of fallout that could happen here. Colin, I wanted to ask you, though, as we looked at this $80 billion trade relationship we have with your country, it's $50 billion going out from America. We import $50 billion from Canada. We export $30 billion. That's about a $20 billion trade deficit. Now, some might look at that and say, that is evidence of unfairness. Speak to that and how we get to these deficits, sometimes just through size and economic health.
Yeah, well, the overall difference in trade is probably equivalent to Elon Musk's salary in a year. So let's not over...
Before or after the $50 billion that he's trying to squeeze out of the court?
It is a very balanced trade, and where you have actually very large U.S. surpluses is in manufacturing and goods. What makes the difference between a U.S. trade surplus and a trade deficit is the energy that comes into this region. Mm-hmm. So if that is a resource that's coming in at a 20% discount from world prices into the Midwest region, 70% of the feedstock into your refineries in the Midwest come from Canada, as we were just talking about. Mm-hmm. It's not, it would be a couple $2 billion per refinery, the folks in the Midwest tell me, to convert that to take another type of crude. So your only other option is Venezuela, right? But all
Well,
the
it would be true if all crude was created equal, but it's
Yeah,
not.
yeah.
Your heavier crude, our refineries are designed to handle that.
Yeah, it would be a monumental and probably decade-long process to reorient those refineries from anything other than what Canada produces. And that is by design because we are a safe and reliable supplier.
There's, the UAW has been rather strong about this, and I had someone on today that say, boy, whenever you hear a conservative Republican and the UAW singing out of the same hymnal, it should make you sit up for a moment and take notice that there's something a little bit off. But Fain says, we are glad to see an American president take aggressive action on ending the free trade disaster that has dropped like a bomb on the working class. Sandy, speak to the fact that there's this notion that if Canada gets an auto job, that's a lost American job. Talk to me about how these jobs are symbiotic and they, to some degree, support each other.
Yeah, so two things. Number one, every time that there is a U.S. company that opens up a plant in Canada, there's also a Canadian company that's opening up a plant here in the United States. So the symbiotic trade relationship that we have is a lot of companies trading, frankly, amongst themselves, right? So you think of a Canadian company like Magna, for example. Canadian-based company, one of the largest auto suppliers in the world. They have plants in the United States and right here in Michigan, right? And of course, you know, our companies, everyone from, you know, Lear to Stellantis and Ford, you know, have plants in Canada. And we have built this, as you said, over 100 years, 100 plus years of having this unified, predictable trade relationship. And if that goes away, then that, you know, it leads to my second point. If that goes away, then how are we as North Americans, as the industrialized world, the Western industrialized world, how can we be expected to effectively combat China? Because that's where we have real trade challenges, where we have real unfair trade practices, where we have the real threat from fake drugs, even fentanyl and others, right?
IP theft.
IP theft, absolutely. So if we are going to go to, you know, combat China, are we better off doing it just as the United States without our allies, because we seem to be burning bridges with our allies, not just here in North America, but with the European Union countries as well, with our Asian friends like Japan and Korea. You know, it's really hard if we have to go do this with China alone. In fact, I can tell you right now, we're not going to be effective in that. So.
Senator, your national security portfolio is really important in this context because we have been told that the steel and the aluminum tariffs, this is a national security priority, that you can't be the arsenal of democracy if you don't have those two building blocks and greater production of it, and that we've lost a lot of that productive capacity. Can you speak to that and whether that necessarily means that those jobs have to be within the borders of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember, you know, people who support tariffs, and you talk about it, that it's lots of different voices who usually don't sing in the same choir, right? Who are supporting the concept of tariffs. And again, it is a credible tool in the toolbox. I think the dispute comes from, like, do you do it as a sledgehammer or as a scalpel? And if you do it as a sledgehammer, then you are creating disruption, and again, that's the point.
Strategic bombing versus carpet bombing.
Yeah, I think right, precision versus carpet, and I think the goal, which I think most people feel good about, is like we want to bring more supply chains back to the United States. We want to create less dependencies on places like China, where we have this confused economic and potentially national security problem with them, right? So the goals are, I think, positive. It's the implementation that I think is changing things. And if you don't have a bridge, right? If you say we're going to put big tariffs on aluminum and all the other specialized secondary metals that come out of that, right? We've got a lot of calls from a lot of defense suppliers to the Pentagon. in Michigan who say, this is the only, we have the specialized metal, we don't make it anymore in the United States, it comes from the EU, we are not able to produce for the US military if we don't have this metal, and we can't afford it if they put these retaliatory tariffs. To me, it's about making sure we have a plan. And that is the thing that I feel most of us feels is missing when one day they're on, another day they're off. No one I don't know many people that argue with the overall goal of returning supply chains. It's the method to the madness that I think is affecting people.
Well, and how badly, and I'm sure Sandy has some thoughts on this, and Colin as well, how badly do you cripple existing domestic manufacturing with higher prices for steel and aluminum to justify what might be a very marginal increase in production or a very marginal increase in employment? I think there was a Federal Reserve of New York did a study on the 2018 steel and aluminum tariffs and concluded that, yeah, we gained 1,000 jobs in the steel sector, but we lost 75,000 jobs in the broader domestic manufacturing because of the high, not to mention the profit-sharing checks at Ford shrunk by $1,000, right? So there are other things to consider here. Colin, I wanted to ask you, I had an economist on today by the name of Tim Nash. He's a very conservative, Milton Friedman-esque guy out of Northwood Institute. Maybe you know Tim. Great guy. He quoted this, and I didn't know if this was correct or not, that the average Canadian purchases, if we talk about a trade imbalance, the average Canadian purchases $10,000 worth of American goods. The average American purchases $1,000 in Canadian goods. And if we talk about trade imbalances, you need to have a wider lens when you look at actual purchasing power. And that a lot of the trade deficit is just because this economy is several times larger than yours.
Yep, it's the factor of 10, right? So let's get real on the steel and aluminum tariffs for a second, right? Because you do import here into the United States 60% of your aluminum. The reason you do that is, and from Canada, the reason you do that is because we have low-cost hydroelectricity, essential for aluminum production. If you were to try to replicate that ecosystem in the United States, you'd have to build another 6 Hoover dams.
Does that change with climate change? Because with dropping water levels, you dialed back your hydroelectric capacity.
We still have significant capacity, and that's why it's positioned there. The 6 Hoover dams that you would have to build to replicate that here is it's a decades long. Even if you could get through all the regulatory and water issues are kind of sensitive in the United States, right? But you'd be talking about a decades long plan. Meanwhile, the cost of the tariff for the landscaper or the contractor in Dearborn trying to buy an F-150, that's a $3,000 hit on the purchase price of an F-150 from the aluminum tariff alone. So think about that over the decade-long reorientation of the U.S. economy to something that doesn't have a comparative advantage in, at the same time as China's moving ahead. And so by the time you actually got a few more smelters built in the United States, in a way that doesn't make any economic sense, China's moved ahead, and that contractor, that landscaper in Dearborn's buying a BYD pickup truck from China. I mean, that's the reality of what we're looking at.
Actually, can I just jump in real quickly, Guy? I'm
No.
so glad you brought in. I'm so glad you brought up the employees, the workers at these automotive because
Yeah.
we're kind of talking about economics, national security, but let's bring it down to what it means for the guy or the gal on the line working, in the Rouge factory building, F-150s. Ford workers, factory workers, got a $12,000 profit-sharing check. General Motors workers got about a $14,000 plus profit-sharing check this year. You add the tariffs, and what does that do? You're going to have two things happen at the same time. You're going to increase the prices for vehicles that people already say are too expensive, right? There's an affordability issue right there. You're going to drive down demand. People will hang on to their old F-150s just that much longer. So think of the ripple impacts of the increased cost and the lower demand and what that does to a Ford Motor Company or a General Motors and what it means to that worker on the line. Because that $14,000 profit-sharing check is going to go away.
I was with a couple of auto dealers this weekend. By the way, my wife's half Canadian, so I'm getting it from all sides. And they have said there is a softness in the market right now. The people that they were calling in March and in April to re-up on leases or to bring in their older car, people that reliably trade in a 3-year-old vehicle, are hanging on longer. People are pressing pause when they see this level of uncertainty. And so there's the direct consequences of the tariff policy, but it's the indirect things that are kind of hard to wrap your heads around and will come up and bite you on the backside. Come April 2nd, Senator, the president had said, look, what we're going to be doing here is no different than just resetting the playing field. So if they're tariffing us at 20% for a widget, we're going to be tariffing at 20% for a widget. What's wrong with that? Equalizing.
Yeah, well, look, I think we've all been watching this on again, off again, hokey pokey dance of will we have these tariffs, will we not? And April 2nd is the big milestone that we're all aiming towards. And I think that the thing that I'm watching happen right now is every industry who has a credible advocacy group, who has senior leaders who are able to call up the White House or call up senior senators, are calling and trying to get exceptions and carve-outs for their industry. And in the first time Trump was in the White House, he had a process at, I think it was the Department of Commerce, where you could apply and try and get some exceptions. And we did get some exceptions for some of our agricultural things, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, it's a bit of a free-for-all, and it's kind of like people doing anything they can to get those exceptions. I don't blame them. But what it means is that the people who have the big government affairs programs, who have the big well-known CEOs, are going to get in those rooms, and the mom and pop who depend on the tiny widget from somewhere else that isn't made anymore in the United States are going to get screwed. They're the ones who I think are going to first get screwed. I think that in general, you're seeing this already happen with these exceptions, for instance, with the potash, right? Every farmer in America uses potash on their fields, like period. It's not a choice. And it's made in 3 countries, right? It's found, excuse me, not made. It's found in 3 countries. Russia, Belarus, Canada, and then, amazingly, the state of Michigan found some,
Everett.
and we have a plan to go and get it because we are going to need it, right? But it's not like you just don't snap your fingers and have a mine, right? And I'm for it. But what happened was the farmers screamed bloody murder and said, you can't, the price of everything we grow. Imagine your grocery bill if everything we grow is going to be 2 times, 4 times, 10 times more expensive. So they screamed bloody murder, and they got their exception. I think what we have now is not a healthy system because the biggest, loudest players may get some relief, and the middlemen and the middle-sized guys and the small guys are going to get screwed in that process.
Colin, there is a pretty loud guy that keeps talking about the 200% dairy tariff. I got to tell you that I was on the National Federation of Milk Producers website. Not a lot of discussion there about the 200% tariff. You would think there'd be more of it if it was an issue. Maybe they've got some issues about how you measure your quotas, but talk to us and kind of clear the fog on that number, that you're imposing this tariff. You were there at the USMCA. If there was a tariff, it was negotiated there by this previous administration.
Absolutely, and frankly, they did fairly well, the other side of the table on that issue. So the U.S. Exports 3 times as many dairy products by value to Canada as goes the other way around, right? We actually have duty-free access under the quota threshold for U.S. dairy going into Canada, and that quota hasn't been used fully. So,
in fact, in many of the segments, it's only at 50%.
Well, 0, right? It's duty-free access. And the real story from the perspective of U.S. dairy farmers is they like that we are having a higher price in Canada to support our dairy farmers, and they want to access that. They're not looking to destroy the Canadian supply management system. Because it's actually working for them when they export into that market.
So to be clear, The 200% tariff may exist within the detail of the USMCA, but it currently
No one is
isn't
paying it. No
being
one pays that.
invoked, and no one is paying it, nor has anybody paid it since the beginning of the USMCA, correct?
That is correct.
And I just want to make clear, when you say the previous administration negotiated the upgrade
The
of
previous
the U.S.
Trump administration.
The previous Trump administration.
Yeah,
Trump's
Trump
guy,
1.0.
Ambassador Lighthizer, shuttled back and forth.
And all
It was-
credit to them, they did a better job opening
it
up the
improved.
Canadian markets to a degree that we hadn't
It
had
improved,
before.
but when President Trump, I mean, let's just call it balls and strikes here. When President Trump is screaming about NAFTA or USMCA, he was the guy who did the negotiation on the current NAFTA. It was his responsibility, and it will reopen again, by the way, in 2026, right? We have to do this kind of review every so often. So he will have another bite at that apple, but let's not miss the fact that he had every opportunity to renegotiate any part of NAFTA he wanted.
So to that point, Colin, is it time, I mean, given the frustrations now, would we be better off reopening the USMCA early, and is that something that your government would consider?
So the more fundamental question is, what is the value of treaty commitments entered into by the United States? So for the last 2 months, we have seen a systematic ignoring of treaty obligations under that USMCA. So the tariffs, so the timeframes on imposing national security measures against Canada, which is just crazy. I mean, let's call it that. Is creating a fundamental question about what it means to negotiate with the United States on economic partnership. Are the commitments that we negotiate going to be respected? So, you know, I think where we are after the first 2 months of the administration is posing that question to ourselves. Can we have an important review of NAFTA, of the new USMCA? Absolutely, but let's remember that has been...
Are you suggesting we're a less credible negotiating partner now? Under 2.0 than perhaps you were coming in 2017 with the new administration?
We're looking at significant tariffs inconsistent with the USMCA being imposed willy-nilly without regard for the commitments that we have negotiated with the United States. That is a problem for the United States, not only in its economic relationship with Canada, that's a problem for its credibility negotiating with the world.
That's diplomatic phrase for yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to, so we're talking about USMCA that, Trump 1.0 negotiated, but let's kind of have a moment of clarity here when it comes to especially the U.S.-Canada relationship. Number one is that even the closest of countries, when they negotiate trade deal, whatever you want to call it, there's certain industries that each side tries to protect a little bit, and say, okay, you protect that industry a little bit, we'll protect this one a little bit. And what we're seeing now, kind of in the media ether, is this hyper focus on, oh, see, the Canadians are doing this, or the Americans are doing this, when at the end of the day, it's not just USMCA negotiated under the first President Trump administration, and it's not even NAFTA, which was negotiated by the first Bush administration and the Clinton administration. It actually goes back much further. US and Canada have had free trade agreements going back to, what, the 1960s?
Go back to the Auto Pact, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so we've had plenty of opportunity over generations, not just a handful of years, but generations, to negotiate this, largest, freest, trade relationship on the planet. And I'm going to raise one other data point. Now, this is an old data point. When I was working for the second President Bush, George W. Bush, there was a study that came out of the Commerce Department that showed that the average American household benefited from the global trade relationships that the United States has had through access to more products, cheaper products, more selection, et cetera, to the tune of $10,000 a year. So when you think about the value for the average household, that's $10,000 that is to the benefit of that household that can be spent on other things because the global trading system makes products more affordable. And the reason why some products are made in some places and some products are made someplace else, just like you were talking about, Colin, I'm so glad you brought up the aluminum example, is that there is a competitive advantage in Canada for aluminum.
Yeah. There's a competitive advantage in most of our trade relationships,
Yeah.
but you have to acknowledge it and not resent it going forward. By the way, we would love to solicit questions from those of you in the audience. If you have a specific question for one of our panelists, we invite you to raise your hand. We've got some cards here, and we'll get to that in about 5 minutes. So if you've got a question, raise your hand, and we'll make sure that you get one of those note cards, and we'll try to get it asked before we move on here. Colin, what would be short-term or long-term then, the solution to this? We do have organized labor saying that we need to do a better job with our trade relationships and bring onshore some of these jobs. And true, maybe that should be directed at China and other parts of our geographic concerns, not Canada. But where does it begin in terms of mending this relationship?
Well, we are at a fork in the road in terms of the relationship. And one side of that fork is cooperating to deal with geostrategic challenges, global competitive challenges together. And we've been doing that. The grand bargain in the USMCA, the new trade agreement, was let's prioritize together North American supply chains. Let's create incentives for increasing wage rates in Mexico. Let's focus together on securing more investment back into our manufacturing ecosystem in the Midwest.
Is there room to negotiate higher content, U.S. content levels in automotive trade?
So you're always looking, there are carrots and sticks that you can use in order to encourage more investment, more manufacturing jobs, a stronger North American economy. I think we are, frankly, one of my critiques of the last negotiation would be that we were looking at all the sticks and not at some of the carrots for bringing more economic players into North America. But the agreement fundamentally worked. So we were both losing investment to Asia. We were seeing a lot of manufacturing jobs move to Mexico. We've seen a doubling of the Mexican minimum wage on the border since the agreement came into place. We've seen the incentives on the wage side really have an impact on prioritizing jobs here in the North American heartland. We've seen record-breaking investment. So, Canadian investors, the Magnas, the Linamars, the Martin Reas of the world in the auto sector, they were primarily investing offshore. Since the new USMCA, you have seen a lot of that come back to Michigan, come back to Ontario, in terms of Canadian investment back in. And you're seeing jobs. You're doing slightly better than we are on the manufacturing job increase under the agreement. But we've both seen record-breaking investment after a period of time when investment was leaving our economy. So we should be focusing on building up our infrastructure together. We should be focused on making sure that we have access to global markets because the world needs what we produce.
Well, there are those that have said that we don't need your lumber, we don't need your cars, which is kind of an interesting term. I did want to ask you about something because this may not even be on the table when the USMCA negotiations are reopened, which is one of your provincial leaders in Alberta has said that they're talking to South Korea, Japan, and other trading partners about taking the 2 million barrels a day of crude that is now directed at America and sending it elsewhere if these tariffs persist or if this breaks down further. Is that an idle threat or is that real?
No, so we now have access to tidewater for our energy supplies, which is new as of last year, because we had been so focused on the north-south relationship. So we now have pipelines out to tidewater. So it's not a threat. It's a reality that if our predictable, reliable, secure partner doesn't need us. We do have to be looking at nation-building projects in Canada. We do have to be looking at other opportunities. And I've been approached over the last couple of weeks by Midwest, Michigan companies who have supplied their Canadian operations from the Midwest, who are now desperate to work with us on how can I resupply my Canadian operations from Europe instead of the Midwest.
Right.
What are the can you expedite regulatory
Again, the
approvals?
unintended consequences.
Right. So, if the U.S. is putting up a tariff wall around its borders, that's a challenge for your economy because we need to be cooperating together to outcompete the rest of the world.
Well, that 2 million barrels a day becomes the soybean market that we lost in 2018.
I do think it's important to say, it's how you approach the country that we're looking at, negotiating with. I am concerned that China is moving into Mexico, buying up plants, wanting to build literally the BYD Chinese electric vehicles where they basically just stole the look of a Tesla. It's $10,000. It's hugely successful in Europe to the point where they're now, freaking out in Europe about how much, Volkswagen's scaling back, everyone's scaling back because these cheap Tesla-looking cars are selling very, very well. I think
and they're good cars.
Right.
I mean, I know the whole thing about Chinese cars. Oh, they're terrible. They're not anymore.
Right. They've improved, and China is heavily subsidizing them. So they're cheap, right? Who doesn't, $10,000 car? I think that it's extremely important that we focus on the threat imposed on us from being overly invested in, for instance, and dependent on China. That is totally different, right, than being dependent in some cases on some things on Canada, right? Because if we have a problem, we're going to negotiate. We're going to work it out. We're going to talk about it. And there's not one day where I say to myself, those Canadian cheaters, every day they're dumping their products. They're stealing intellectual property. Like, maybe I'm mad they make more maple syrup than we do. But in general, that's not my concern. When we wake up in the morning, I ran a defense supply chain task force after COVID because we were finding how dependent we were on China for a lot of things. And we realized that the propellant in our explosive devices, in our bombs, 90% of the original chemicals were coming from China. So if we ever, God forbid, had to go to war with China, 90% of our exploding ordnance would be dependent on China. That feels like a bad vulnerability. Let's agree that we don't want that, and then we take steps to divest ourselves from that. That's a completely different conversation than Canada, right? There's not a day in my life I'm worried about that.
And it's a conversation we're not hearing. We're hearing about Canadian dairy tariffs that haven't been levied yet.
Right, yeah. I just think it's like, look over here, look over here. On China, that's a much more serious and complicated conversation.
We've got a couple questions from our audience, so let's quickly wrap up this.
Just real quickly, so I see my friend Glenn Stevens from Mishado in the audience here, and he asks a great question. So you talked about the Chinese building automotive plants in Mexico. What happens when a governor says, oh, BYD, you guys want to build a plant in our state? Then we have Chinese-built cars being built right here in the United States. So when you think about the Chinese threat, to me, I'm a little less concerned about Mexico. I'm more concerned about a southern governor saying, sure, we'll take a plant.
And how much has the EU lost in its market share to BYD?
About a third.
For
Yeah,
in
I
Of
EVs,
overall.
in EVs, I think it's about 50%
Yeah.
now.
Yeah,
pen-
overall.
And
penetration.
the first car was sold, the first Chinese BYD car was sold in 2021. So this isn't like a
Right.
20-year crusade. This is a very near-term threat. And I will just say, let me be clear that as the new senator, I will lay my body in front of the border before I let Chinese electric vehicles come inside the United States. We have to be bipartisan in favor of that, because that is like a walking, driving collection unit for their intel. It's all our data, all our full motion video, all our 3D mapping, all our LiDAR. No, 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 no.
And you know, frankly, Canada has just imposed in the fall, sort of before the current administration, imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, imposed the 25% duties on steel and aluminum from China, because we're all in on the North American partnership. And we just got hit by pretty significant Chinese retaliation. So we're getting it from both sides at the moment. We're getting hit by China, which we anticipate. We did not anticipate getting hit by the United States.
Question for you, Colin. This is from one of our audience members. With the brand new PM and national election, how will Carney-led Canada differ in tack from the Trudeau administration when it comes to this important economic relationship?
The Canadian people are highly unified on, you know, it's been partially the tariff question, partially the annexation comments, the 51st state comments. It is unified and fortified the Canadian population to sort of stand up for its economic interests in a way that I haven't seen before. That frankly doesn't give a lot of wiggle room to Canadian governments to do anything other than stand up Canada strong. So I don't think with Prime Minister Carney, with whatever the outcome of the Canadian election going forward, that you are going to fundamentally see much difference in the Canadian approach to what is in some ways an existential threat to our economy. But for this audience, for Michigan, it is a fundamental threat to your long-term competitiveness here. And I love, you know, elbows up Michigan in defending what we have built here together, because if we don't, the jobs that we've relied on in the Great Lakes economy are going to go south, and not just in Mexico, as you're saying, but this, you know, the southern states as well. Because you can't put up a border wall that shuts you off from your largest export market, shuts down your supply chains, disrupts your distribution channels, and think the Great Lakes is going to come out of that A-OK. It's just not going to happen.
One sector of the economy that we inadvertently ignored here, and a question from one of our audience members, how do you think these tariffs will impact healthcare? We know that during COVID, we were heavily reliant on nurses coming across the bridge. In terms of hospitals, hospital suppliers, what are you hearing from them? Because we are reliant for supplies and labor.
I met last week with the Michigan Hospital Association, so it is all the big leaders of all of our hospitals across the state. Actually, what they were raising with me on tariffs was not Canadian tariffs or Canadian workforce. It was that some of our most advanced medical devices, think like an MRI machine, those kinds of things, we are heavily dependent on China. And so the ability to get new machines, get them for a price they can afford, they're very, very concerned about it. When you add to that threats to Medicaid, our hospitals, our rural hospitals, are legitimately wondering, like, can they survive
Those
this?
that are left.
Right, those that are left. So I just will say that was their primary concern. We do know that we have a nursing shortage in general, and we've had one for a long time. And our Canadian nurses and doctors were extremely important. People may not remember that when we got the vaccine first, and the Canadians were a little bit later in having it, I think we met in the tunnel, right? We at the border, exact border under the river, and vaccinated a bunch of Canadian kind of frontline folks because of how important they are to us. So I don't know that tariffs would impact. Besides the feeling that, Canadians being frustrated with the United States, I don't know if tariffs would affect human beings coming over to work in our places, but it certainly doesn't create for a comfortable conversation, that's for sure. But I'm very worried about Michigan hospitals for tariff reasons, not necessarily Canadian tariffs.
But I think what Colin said, really, what you said about the changing dynamics, I'm just going to call it the political and social dynamics in Canada, cannot be overstated. You know, when Americans get booed at hockey games, when you're seeing, you know, grocers and retailers in Canada proactively just taking American products off the shelves that they've already paid for, right? And what's interesting about what President Trump has done is that, Prime Minister Trudeau was obviously in a very weak political position kind of going into the Trump administration. Now, the Liberal Party is actually really re-energized. I mean, there's, what was almost certain to be a Tory-led government at the next Canadian election. I'm not going to ask Colin to comment on politics, but I think it's now 50-50 at best. I mean, the Liberals might actually have a lead there. So, Senator, I'm actually a little concerned about the 6,000 healthcare workers that cross the border from Canada into the Detroit metro area every day to work at Corwell and DMC and Henry Ford Health System because of that changing dynamic.
Sentiment.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, they have opportunities in Canada, so might that dynamic say, listen, it may not be my employer that I'm mad at, but if me going over to the United States is sending a message that I am not supporting my country, Canada, when Canada needs to be supported, I would worry about that supply chain of labor.
All right. We've got, forgive me if I didn't get to your questions, but we've run out of time. I'd like to give each one of you just 1 to 2 minutes in terms of a closing statement, if you will, or just a closing thought. And Colin, let's start with you.
Well, maybe just on that last point, Canadians still love Americans, and we are super proud of the nursing and the doctor staff who helped out when Detroit was at the epicenter of the pandemic. We're super proud that we had water bombers over LA helping respond to the forest fires. That's what we've always done between Canada and the United States. You guys were there for us when we had the forest fires out west just recently. That is the relationship we've developed. It's always been a model to the world. And I really worry about the moment that we're in because the American project that has brought peace and security to the world for the last 80 years, there's been no bigger booster of that American project than Canada because it has worked for everyone. If we're in a beggar thy neighbor world, I worry for all of us. And we can do better, and it was a bit rock and roll at the beginning of the last Trump administration in terms of the relationship. We came out with a better, more effective trade agreement out of it. So it's not that we can't manage to pull rabbits out of a hat, but we really need to focus on the importance of this relationship and working together.
Yeah, I would just say, it is, we haven't mentioned, but in the middle of this moment, right, in September, we're opening the Gordie Howe Bridge, if everything goes on time. I mean, and you'll be able to drive from Montreal to Miami without stopping at a stoplight. And we did that because the volume of trade is just unbelievable. Our Canadian friends paid for it. It's cross hockey sticks when you drive through the bridge. It's going to be amazing. So the fact that that is happening in the middle of this incredibly difficult and scratchy period between our countries is a reminder of the sort of the historic relationship that we have that will go on long beyond this next 4 years, and I believe that in a very serious way. But I think to me, even more important in this conversation, if I may say so, than our relationship with the Canadians, is that we are going to be paying more for everything in our life, and we are risking a self-inflicted recession in the United States of America, right? With no offense to our Canadian friends. If we were going to see cheaper products and manufacturing was coming over the border back home, then I would say, look, okay, I don't like disrupting my friends, but it's worth it because I'm an American and I want our economy to thrive. Right now, all the indicators are going in the other direction. And that, to me, as a national security person, we call balls and strikes. If it were working for our economy, I would be interested. But to me, the economic indicators are going in the wrong way, and we cannot stay silent as the state that would be most affected and as certainly for me as an elected representative, the risk of a recession is so much more important than anything else that I do. Then we got to speak clearly about that risk.
Canada has not only supported and been engaged in every conflict that the United States has been in, but they've always been first in line. The Canadians are the ones who saved our hostages in the late 1970s in Iran at great peril to their own lives and their own country's reputation. On 9/11, when we needed to land, Senator, how many jumbo jets did we land in Gander? Like 75, something like 70. And this, Canada took the international jets for the United States. This is not how you treat a friend, especially your best friend, and especially when treating your best friend is going to boomerang on to ourselves and lead to higher prices, less economic output. If there was a clear end game that I or the business leaders I represent understood, I might be more sympathetic, but I've yet to see that.
We should be pointing out that the two of you have worked in Republican administrations too. That this is not a partisan.
Like I said, if it was prepared to be a huge boon to the United States, I would deal with the scratchiness with our Canadian friends, and we would be the beneficiaries of it. But that unless someone shows me the money on that, I'm not seeing it. Sorry.
Maybe if you say it really loud like Cuba Gooding.
Oh,
Colin Bird, Senator Slotkin, Sandy Baruah, thank you, all three of you. Thank you.
And Guy Gordon.
Thank you. Guy Gordon.
Guy for a day.